The American project, as understood by Klein and Thompson, is the opposite of the American project. Instead, they seek to install the 21st century Marxist ideal of the entrepreneurial state, something that I had mentioned in our last podcast. This is the fourth out of four in a series, and I want to discuss the conclusion to the book, as well as make some comments about the effects that might occur, or in fact are occurring, if people were to adopt the philosophy and the ideas of the authors of this book. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moneyball Method podcast. Thank you for joining me. My name is Mark Shupe, the author of the book, The Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. My conversation today will be my last one regarding the book titled Abundance by Ezra, Klein, and Thompson. This is the fourth out of four in a series, and I want to discuss the conclusion to the book, as well as make some comments about the effects that might occur, or in fact are occurring, if people were to adopt the philosophy and the ideas of the authors of this book. And I'm going to begin by reading the opening sentence of the last paragraph of the conclusion. It says, "Abundance contains within it a bigness that befits the American project." That is true. However, the authors have a thorough misunderstanding of the American project. America is a country and a society and a government formed on an idea. That idea is individual rights. By extension, that includes political liberty and a legal system of objective law. In addition to that, the organic outgrowth of that, the socioeconomic system that will naturally manifest itself by the American project, is capitalism. And capitalism naturally leads abundance, or leads to abundance. However, the authors of the book reject individual rights, they reject political liberty, and they reject a system of objective law. They are proposing the antithesis, the opposite of the American project, and that is a monolithic government control over all economic events. In other words, communism. However, communism has manifested itself over the last 50 or 60 years in the form of environmentalism. We must sacrifice, we must be austere, we must save the planet. However, Klein and Thompson have had an epiphany. They recognize the destruction of the environmental movement with regard to the heavy burden of the regulatory state, particularly in America, the Environmental Protection Agency, and on top of that, massive, wasteful, destructive investments in wind and solar projects. To quote Abundance again, environmentalists realized that sacrifice and scarcity was losing politics. It is. They needed a strategy that married the life Americans want with the clean energy the planet could tolerate. So now the new communists are rejecting the environmentalist regulatory state, but for what purpose? I'll get to that in a minute. But let's get back to capitalism. If we want to juxtapose communism and capitalism, philosopher Harry Binswanger does a good job. Gives us a starting point that says the political economic expression of individualism is capitalism, the system of private property and free trade for private profit. If Americanism means anything, it means capitalism. So the point of my introductory comments here is to prove that the American project, as understood by Klein and Thompson, is the opposite of the American project. Instead, they seek to install the 21st century Marxist ideal of the entrepreneurial state, something that I had mentioned in our last podcast. To quote the book, Marx's aim was not to turn the production machine off, but to direct its ends toward a shared abundance, to unburden the forces of production and make possible that which had been impossible to imagine. Shared abundance, in other words, equality. We're getting back to the centuries-old argument that equality is an ideal, but equality of what? That is the difference between the American project and communism. Under the American project, it is equal justice under the law, specifically objective law, where people understand laws are and what the proposed penalties might be. In terms of the communist ideal, equality is equality of outcomes. In fact, President Franklin Roosevelt said so in his Second American Bill of Rights back in the 1940s. Equality of housing opportunities and food access and medical services and compensation for hours worked, equality of outcomes. That implies that everyone is equal, as if we are all herd animals living in a barnyard, and that is the goal, Animal Farm. George Orwell wrote about it famously in a book of the same title. Unburden the forces of production. What are the forces of production? I discussed that last week. It is economic power. Economic power involves rights, political liberty, creativity, the power of the mind. And in order for the mind to work efficiently, in order for human beings to thrive and have meaning and purpose in their lives, they need political liberty, they need economic freedom. The only thing that burdens the forces of production is force, whether it is the force of government or the force of a criminal or the force of an invading army. Force is the enemy to free will and to production and to prosperity, and it is impossible to unburden production with more government force, because for the simple reason that government is force. Legitimate government has a monopoly on retaliatory force in order to help defend and enforce rights, protect private property, make possible that which had been impossible to imagine. Only free minds can imagine the future and think long term. That is the essence of capitalism. That is why capitalism works. The purpose of capitalism is not prosperity for everyone. That is a secondary benefit. The purpose of capitalism is economic freedom, political liberty, being able to determine your own future through your own productivity, your own ideas, your own effort, and mutual cooperation with other like-minded people. Regarding the book Abundance, Klein and Thompson write, investments in solar and wind installation and electrical vehicle plants and factories to manufacture next generation batteries have skyrocketed upward since. Upward since when? Upward since the Biden administration instigated their Inflation Reduction Act, which had absolutely nothing to do with inflation. They do not even understand what it is. Neither does the Federal Reserve, for that matter, which renders the Fed irrelevant, but I digress. But what Klein and Thompson are doing is they are now jumping on the bandwagon of power generation. They are jumping on the bandwagon of massive construction that is happening for data centers all over America and all over the world, mostly funded actually by private capital, whether it be Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, the owners of ChatGPT, and many others that are now dominate the S&P 500. Why have Thompson and Klein jumped on the bandwagon for large construction of manufacturing facilities generating electrical power? In other words, why is environmental impact no longer important? Why has electric power generation become the holy grail of today's communists. To answer the first question, the New York Times could no longer hide the environmental destruction of wind and solar projects. To me, this is reminiscent of the current wars that reached their pinnacle in 1893 World Exposition in Chicago. The current wars were in fight for economic power, voluntarily, using private capital, between Westinghouse and Edison, between alternating current and direct current. The World's Exposition in Chicago in 1893 was the catalyst. It was the turning point for changing the world in ways that were truly unimaginable, certainly unimaginable to Klein and Thompson, but not unimaginable to Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. It was the race to the top, a new world of unimaginable possibilities that we are the beneficiaries, and that the communists that want to take over all power generation could actually destroy. Electric power has become the holy grail. But what happened? What changed their minds? I would argue that it started with Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, the massive electrical power that is needed to mine Bitcoin is staggering. However, there's something even bigger, something that the proponents of the abundance agenda believe will achieve their utopian dream of equality. And that is artificial intelligence, what we know as AI. And the reason for all of the massive construction projects around America and around the world for the creation of clean electrical power. But clean is in the eye of the beholder. There's nothing clean about solar and wind. They are environmentally destructive. They use massive amounts of hydrocarbons to create the installations and maintain them. But crypto and AI demand requires massive amounts of new electricity, and in turn, the machinery that is in fact frozen intelligence to make those plants operable, and then to operate the robotic machines of the future that ostensibly will create equality for everyone. But in fact, the machine is frozen intelligence. And at the same time, the abundance agenda folks are actually going to paralyze intelligence through government force, through a universal, omniscient, and omnipotent state. But therein lies the rub. And this is why I discovered about this book that I hinted at in the first podcast and in the opening Substack article. What are the arch enemies of communism? They are money and the mind. Bitcoin is a form of money. Machinery is a form of the mind. It is frozen intelligence. The 21st century communists, at least the ones behind the abundance agenda, have now embraced money and the mind in the form of cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence as being the holy grail for this utopian dream of universal equality. However, we live in a culture that debases money, that degrades profits, that denigrates markets, and that demonizes profit. Where is all the capital going to come from to create this utopian dream? This is a contradiction. It can't possibly happen. Well, let's get back to the basic problem that the abundance agenda is trying to solve, the economic issue that is on the minds of many people throughout America and throughout the world, and that is affordability. This book talks about housing, medical services, transportation, all being paid for by the government with unlimited funding from God knows where. And affordability has become a new political agenda. And we have seen the results of that new political agenda in the heart of capitalism, in the city whose signature is money and the mind, in New York City. The mayor of New York has proposed a political agenda to get himself elected based on free housing, free groceries, free transportation, free childcare, free medical care for all the residents of New York and everywhere else. The good news is that the new mayor of New York is thoroughly incompetent, totally uninformed, and impotent. We can rest comfortably knowing that in the long run, reality always wins. Reason, purpose, and pride are the driving forces of a happy and productive individual. The Moneyball Method is trying to restore the virtues of money, the information of prices, the elegance of markets, and the justice of profits in the minds of people who are inclined to live with reason, purpose, and pride. So whenever you hear this individual who won the mayor's race in New York described as a socialist and communist, beware. Those are the labels he wants you to use. The man is a destroyer. The man is in favor of hostage brutality. He is in favor of gang rape, and he is in favor of child roasting. He endorses jihad. He endorses the global intifada. He endorses Hamas. So let's call a spade a spade. A destroyer is a destroyer. The Moneyball Method is about creativity, the power of the mind, and people like the mayor of New York are incompetent and impotent. In my next podcast, I will talk further about the solutions to the affordability problem through the lens of free markets, capitalism, productivity, and independence. Thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you next week.